Hi, it's Dave Oates, head researcher at FinderMonkey. We've had a question come through which I'm going to try and answer, but probably it asks a question itself. So the question has been, is it possible to get access to closed adoption records? The first thing that sort of springs into my mind when somebody asks that question is, what do we mean by a closed adoption? It might be something that a term that people use, and it might also be a term that's used in other countries officially. In England and Wales, certainly, it isn't like such a really recognised term. But I think what most people would understand to mean, if somebody said a closed adoption, would be an adoption where the information's being kept private, I suppose. And effectively, the answer to that question is no, you can't access that information. The only exception to that is for the adopted person themselves. They can access, in England and Wales, their own adoption records. Once they reach the age of 18, they can make an application to the agency that dealt with their adoption and gain access to their records to understand more about their adoption. It's also possible for a birth relative to access information within those adoption records, but nothing about the adopted person that would identify them. It's usually just in case of, for a birth mother, say, understanding what information was recorded about her at the time, and you are entitled as a birth mother, for instance, to access that information. A closed adoption obviously means it's private, but I think you can get circumstances where people are adopted, but actually one of the parents who adopts them was a birth parent. So I've seen examples of a woman having a child with somebody and then going on to get married to somebody else perhaps, and that husband adopting a child that they already had but wasn't their biological father. So while you might not actually know, the actual adoption records might not be available, it's still possible to work out what's happened to that child because it's available in other public records such as marriage records. Where you can see that somebody's got married and you know they kept that child. It's possible that child took the name of their husband, sometimes through adoption, sometimes not as well. And I've also seen it happen the other way around, where a man might have had a child with a woman and the woman actually gives the child up, but the father keeps the child, and often the child can be then adopted by his wife, which might sound unusual, but it does happen. So in terms of who else can access the records, or if you wanted to find somebody affected through adoption or separated through adoption, you're going to usually need the help of a professional, and that would usually be a registered adoption support agency, or the help of the agency that originally placed or arranged the adoption. Now, it's the responsibility of the agency that arranged an adoption to keep those records. Historically, it was for 75 years. More recently, it's been raised to 100 years. And that means effectively for most living people during your lifetime, those records should be accessible as the adopted person, or if you're a birth relative, that you could approach that agency and register a wish or an interest in perhaps tracing an adopted person, and they might well help you do that. The problem comes in that historically, so if you think about in the 1960s, the number of adoptions was very, very high. And so, because there were so many agencies because there were so many adoptions at that time, a lot of those agencies no longer exist because they're just simply not needed anymore. So what then you have an issue is you have to trace where their records have been transferred to, which would always happen. Those records should be, in theory, always be kept. Often they'll be transferred to another adoption agency, but also they can be transferred to a local authority as well. So finding out where adoption records are can be the most tricky part for most people. If you're seeking access to your adoption records as an adopted person, you want access to them, you can usually access them through your own local authority, and your local authority then has to figure out where those records are and help you get access to them. They're obliged to do that. What I would say in those circumstances, it can often be a really, really slow process. There's often a waiting list, limited resource to obviously dedicate to that kind of service at this moment in time. And so it will often be several months, but it totally depends upon the local authority where you live, but also where the records actually end up being held and how long it takes for the release of the records from that agency. So it's a case of agencies talking to agencies, and depending on the agencies that are involved will totally determine how long it takes, which can be very, very quick, and sometimes it can take months and months and months. And I've known people be waiting in excess of 2 years in probably the very worst cases. So I hope that answers that question about what is a closed adoption record, or how can you access closed adoption records. But if anyone does have any other questions, please let me know. Pop them in the comments below or send us a message, and I'll be more than happy to try and answer them for you.